All right, let's jump right in today. We're talking naval power, specifically the U.S. and China. I found this video by Global Money Talk, and they ask a pretty important question. Can the U.S. Navy, really hold on to its top spot as China's naval power keeps growing?
Yeah, that's a big question these days, especially when you look at just how much China is building up their navy.
For sure, and that's one of the first things this video points out. It compares the U.S. Navy back in 1949, where they controlled a whopping 71% of, well, global naval power, to today, where things are looking a lot different.
Yeah, it's a different world now, that's for sure. One of the biggest things driving that change is it's their shipbuilding. They can build ships at a rate 23 times greater than the U.S. Think about that. For every single warship the U.S. makes, China pumps out 230.
230. Wow. Okay, that's a huge difference. But what does that actually mean? I mean, in terms of the balance of power out there.
Well, for one, it means China's cutting up quickly, just in terms of sheer numbers of ships, right? By 2035, they're projected to have something like 475 warships, compared to the U.S. with 317. But it's not just about quantity, right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. A brand new ship's got to be a lot more powerful than one that's been around for, decades.
Exactly. The age of the fleets really matters. China's navy is a lot younger, on average only like 14, 15 years old. Meanwhile, the U.S. fleet is working with ships that are on average 24 years old. So the U.S. is facing a massive challenge just to modernize, keep up with China's growth.
Like they're trying to catch up while the other guy's already sprinting ahead.
Yeah, kind of. And it's not just building new ships either. China's being strategic about where they put these ships, using what's called the island chain strategy.
Right. I've heard that term before. Island chain strategy. Could you explain what that means and why it's such a big deal?
Sure. So basically, China's working to control a bunch of island chains. They stretch all the way from Japan down to Indonesia. These chains, they act as like defensive barriers, but they also let China project power further out into the Pacific. It has big implications for, everything. Trade routes, access to resources, you name it.
So it's about controlling those key waterways, not just having a bunch of ships.
Exactly. And this is where it gets tough for the U.S. If China can really control these island chains, it could really mess with the U.S. Navy's ability to operate freely in the Pacific, especially if there's, a crisis.
So, if we're thinking of this like a chessboard, China's setting up their pieces to control the important squares, and the U.S. is trying to figure out their next move.
A good way to put it. One move the U.S. is making is turning to their allies in the region, specifically South Korea and Japan. We see this in a few ways, like with South Korean shipyards starting to repair U.S. Navy ships now.
Interesting. You wouldn't normally think of the U.S. needing help with something like, ship repair. Is that because they're lacking resources?
He definitely shows how strange their resources are, trying to modernize their own fleet and, be present all over the globe. It's a lot of pressure on the U.S. shipbuilding industry.
And getting repairs from allies is just one part of it. Seems like they're also pushing those allies to do more to counter China's influence.
Absolutely. There's a lot of pressure on countries like South Korea and Japan to up their defense spending, basically contribute more to security in the region. South Korea already spends a good chunk of their GDP on defense, like 2.8%, which is a lot.
Yeah, especially since their economy isn't as good as the U.S. or China's. So this isn't just a military thing for the U.S., it's economic diplomatic too, right?
Exactly. The U.S. is juggling its own domestic stuff with needing to stay strong in the Pacific. That means dealing with some complicated relationships with their allies and basically asking them to do more both financially and militarily.
So we've got this external pressure from China's growing Navy, and now we're talking about internal challenges the U.S. is facing. And this brings to mind the whole discussion around the Jones Act and how it affects U.S. shipbuilding.
Right. So the Jones Act, it's this law, almost 100 years old, that says any goods shipped between U.S. ports have to be on ships built, owned, and operated by Americans. It was meant to protect the U.S. maritime industry, but in today's world, it's become kind of a problem.
So even though the U.S. needs to build ships faster, this law is kind of slowing them down. Sounds a little counterproductive.
It's a tricky situation. The Jones Act has gotten a lot of flack for driving up shipping costs and slowing down shipbuilding. That's a big disadvantage when you're up against someone like China who's building ships so quickly.
It's like trying to run a marathon with weights strapped to your ankles. Makes you wonder how the U.S. can deal with all this internal stuff while also, dealing with China's growing Navy.
It's a tough problem, no doubt, and it shows how the U.S. needs to be flexible and adapt their approach. But beyond shipbuilding and domestic policies, there's another layer to this, something pretty interesting, maybe even a bit worrying. China's idea of unrestricted warfare.
Unrestricted warfare. Sounds kind of like something out of a sci-fi movie. What does that even mean?
It's a concept that really shakes up how we think about warfare. It comes from a Chinese military strategy book, and it basically says warfare isn't just about traditional military force anymore. It's way broader than that.
So we're not just talking like tanks and missiles.
Nope, not at all. Now we're talking cyber attacks, messing with the economy, information warfare, even things like, and this might surprise you, the fentanyl trade.
Wait, fentanyl trade. How does that fit into unrestricted warfare?
That's the wild part. It's about using any means necessary to get what you want, even if it's outside the normal bounds of war. It's about disruption, making things unstable, gaining an advantage, all without, actually going to war in the traditional sense.
So how do you even fight back against something like that? It seems like the usual military stuff wouldn't work too well against those tactics.
That's the big question. It requires a whole new way of thinking about defense and security. It's not just about having bigger weapons or faster planes anymore. It's about cybersecurity, making society more resilient, and figuring out how to counter disinformation and propaganda.
So it's like a new arms race, but it's happening online, in the media, even in people's minds, right?
Exactly. And this race has already started.
And this brings us back to the KDDX project, South Korea's plan. If they're building up their Navy, what advantages would those new destroyers give them in this unrestricted warfare world?
Now that's where things get interesting. These aren't your average destroyers. The KDDX will have all the latest tech, including advanced radar, powerful electronic warfare systems, and maybe even directed energy weapons.
Directed energy weapons. Sounds like something out of Star Wars.
Maybe, but it's not as futuristic as you might think. We're talking about weapons that use focused beams of energy, like lasers or microwaves, to take out targets. They have some serious advantages over regular weapon speed, precision, the ability to hit multiple targets fast.
So these KDDX destroyers, they could play a big role in defending against like cyber attacks or missile launches.
That's the plan. They'll be a big part of what's called multi-domain operations, where forces work seamlessly across land, sea, air, space, you name it. These ships will be like a hub in a big defense network, able to share info, coordinate actions, and respond to threats from all sides.
Sounds like they're building a naval Swiss Army knife, ready for anything. But let's circle back to those potential joint operations between South Korea and Japan. What does the U.S. see as the benefits there?
Well, strategically, combining those two navies would create a very strong force in the region. Japan's maritime self-defense force is already top-notch, especially when it comes to anti-submarine warfare and patrols.
So it's about using each navy's strengths to make a stronger, more unified force.
Exactly. By combining their knowledge and resources, those two countries could really improve their ability to keep an eye on what China's Navy is doing, protect those vital sea lanes, and respond to potential problems.
But how would that actually work? Would we see joint patrols, training together, or even sharing, sensitive intelligence?
All of those are possibilities, yeah. How much they integrate would depend on the political will and, of course, the trust between the two countries.
Which is where all that historical baggage comes back into play.
Right. Building that kind of trust takes time, especially with those deep-seated historical issues. But the U.S. is betting that the shared concerns about security and, the potential threat from China will eventually be more important than those past disagreements.
It's a risky bet, but the potential reward in terms of, security in the region is huge. But it's not just about military cooperation either. We were talking earlier about the economic pressures involved here. How is the U.S. balancing its own economic interests with the need to, be strong in the Pacific?
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act. On one hand, they want to stay competitive economically and protect American jobs. On the other hand, they got to spend a lot on defense to counter China's growing military.
Sounds like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. How are they dealing with that?
Well, one way is by working with allies strategically. They're encouraging countries like South Korea and Japan to spend more on their own defense, which in turn opens up opportunities for American defense companies.
So it's about sharing the burden, both financially and militarily.
Precisely. The U.S. is using their alliances to spread out the responsibility for defense, which lightens their own financial load while still making them strong in the region.
But doesn't that risk causing some, friction? What if those allies feel like they're being taken advantage of?
That's a valid point. The U.S. has to be careful about how they come across to their allies. It's not just about demanding more money or troops. It's about building real partnerships based on, shared goals and respect.
So it's not just a military game. It's not just an economic game. It's also a diplomatic game, right?
Absolutely. Succeeding in the Pacific means having a multi-pronged approach using diplomacy, economics, and military strength. It's about creating a network of alliances and partnerships that can effectively push back against China's growing influence without, starting a war.
It's like the U.S. is walking a tightrope, trying to stay on top while the whole world is changing around them.
You got it. The old rules don't apply anymore. The U.S. needs to be faster, smarter, and work better with others if they want to hold their position in a world where power is becoming more, well, spread out.
This conversation has been really eye-opening. We've covered so much: the sheer size of China's navy, the strategy behind those island chains, the whole idea of unrestricted warfare, and how all of this affects people on the ground.
Yeah, and we've seen how this rivalry is changing everything, not just the military, but the economy and diplomacy too. It's a complicated situation with no easy solutions. But by understanding the details, we can start to think about what it all means for global stability and, the future of the world.
One thing I'm taking away from this is how connected everything is. It's not just about who has the biggest guns. It's about history, economics, diplomacy, and how people see each other.
Right, and that's why it's so important to look at the big picture, to consider all these things when trying to understand these, complicated global challenges.
So for our listeners who are now thinking about all of this, what's the one question they should be asking themselves as they, keep exploring this topic?
I'd say the most important question is, in a world where it's harder and harder to tell the difference between peace and conflict, where the old ideas about war are changing, and where economic and diplomatic tools are just as important as military power, how do we keep the world stable?
That's a big question, and one that we'll probably be debating for a long time. But by having these conversations, by trying to understand different viewpoints, and by thinking critically about the challenges we face, we can start to find a path toward a more peaceful and prosperous future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another look at the forces shaping our world. Yeah, you keep bringing up that history between South Korea and Japan. It's got to be tough to get those two to work together militarily, right? I mean, given their past.
Yeah, their history is, well, it's complicated. There's a lot of baggage there. Japanese colonialism, wartime atrocities, all that stuff still casts a pretty big shadow on their relationship. A lot of people in South Korea, they just don't trust Japan, especially when it comes to the military.
It's like asking, I don't know, two siblings who've always fought to suddenly become best friends. How is the U.S. even approaching that,
Carefully, that's for sure. It's a delicate situation. The U.S. is trying to, emphasize that shared threat from China, saying they need to work together against, Beijing's growing power. They're also using those security alliances they have with both countries, framing it as a way to, strengthen those ties and keep things stable in the region.
But, wouldn't pushing too hard for them to work together, backfire? Wouldn't that make South Korea mad and maybe even, fuel some anti-U.S. sentiment?
Oh, absolutely. There's a real risk of that. The U.S. has to be careful not to look like they're, calling all the shots or forcing South Korea into something they're not comfortable with. It's a tough balance, trying to do what's strategically necessary while also respecting their allies' history and feelings.
So it's not just about ships and weapons, right? It's about understanding history, diplomacy, and even cultural perceptions.
Exactly. These are all human factors. You can't ignore them if you want to build a strong coalition against China.
And speaking of China, we were talking about their unrestricted warfare idea before. I'm still trying to picture what that would look like in, real life. Can you give me, an example?
Okay, so imagine this. There's this coordinated attack on a country's important infrastructure, right? Starts with cyber attacks that shut down banks and mess with the power grid, cause chaos in transportation. At the same time, you've got this disinformation campaign flooding social media, fake news everywhere, stirring up fear and, confusion.
Sounds a bit like a spy movie, honestly. Could that actually happen?
Well, we're already seeing bits and pieces of it happening around the world. Think about all those ransomware attacks lately hitting hospitals, governments, businesses, or those sophisticated campaigns spreading fake news to mess with elections and, create division in society.
It's kind of scary to think about war being so, widespread and underhanded, attacking the very fabric of a society instead of, traditional military targets.
Yeah, that's the whole point of unrestricted warfare, blurring the lines between war and peace, finding weaknesses everywhere, and achieving your goals without actually, fighting a traditional war.
So how do you even fight back against that? It doesn't seem like the usual military responses would be very effective.
That's the million-dollar question. It requires a whole new way of thinking about defense. It's not about building bigger bombs anymore. It's about cybersecurity, making sure society can bounce back from attacks, and figuring out how to counter all that disinformation and propaganda.
So it's a whole different kind of arms race, right? One that's fought online, in the media, even in people's minds.
Exactly. And it's already happening.
This brings us back to South Korea and their KDDX project. If they're beefing up their Navy, what specific advantages would those fancy new destroyers give them in this new world of unrestricted warfare?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. These aren't your run-of-the-mill destroyers. They're going to be packed with the latest tech. Think advanced radar systems, powerful electronic warfare capabilities, and maybe even directed energy weapons.
Directed energy weapons, like lasers and stuff.
Yeah, things like that. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. These weapons use concentrated beams of energy, could be lasers or microwaves, to disable or even destroy targets. They have a bunch of advantages over, traditional guns and missiles, things like speed, accuracy, and being able to hit multiple targets really quickly.
So these KDDX destroyers, they could be a big help in defending against things like cyber attacks or, missile launches.
That's the idea. They'll be a key part of what's called multi-domain operations. That's where you have forces working together seamlessly across land, sea, air, space, cyberspace, the whole 9 yards. These ships will be like a node in this big interconnected defense network, able to share information, coordinate, and respond to threats from, well, pretty much anywhere.
It sounds like they're building like a naval Swiss Army knife ready for anything. But let's go back to those joint operations between South Korea and Japan. What's the U.S. hoping to gain from that?
Well, strategically speaking, if you combine the South Korean and Japanese navies, you get a pretty formidable force in the region. Japan's maritime self-defense force is already pretty strong, especially when it comes to anti-submarine warfare and maritime patrols.
So it's about, taking the best of both navies and making a more cohesive and effective force.
Exactly. If they pool their expertise and resources, those two countries could really improve their ability to keep an eye on what the Chinese Navy's up to, protect those vital shipping lanes, and respond to any, potential crises.
But how would that actually work? Would we see, like, joint patrols, them training together, or maybe even sharing intelligence?
All of that's on the table, yeah. How much they integrate would depend on the political will and, of course, the level of trust between them.
Which is where all that history comes back to bite them, right?
Yeah, that's a big factor. Building trust takes time, especially with all that baggage between them. But the U.S. is hoping that, shared worries about security and the threat from China will outweigh those past issues.
It's a big gamble. But if it works, the payoff in terms of, regional security could be huge. But it's not just about military cooperation either. We were talking about the economic side of things earlier. How's the U.S. balancing its own economic interests with needing to be strong in the Pacific?
Yeah, that's a tricky balancing act. On the one hand, the U.S. wants to stay economically competitive and, protect American jobs. But on the other hand, they have to spend a lot on defense to counter China's growing military power.
I mean, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. How are they navigating that?
One way is by working with allies strategically. They're encouraging countries like South Korea and Japan to increase their own defense spending, which, creates opportunities for American defense contractors.
So it's about sharing the burden, both financially and militarily.
Exactly. The U.S. is using their alliances to create a more distributed network of defense capabilities. That way, they can lessen their own financial burden while also strengthening their position in the region.
But doesn't that risk causing some, friction? What if those allies start feeling like they're being taken advantage of?
That's a valid point. The U.S. needs to be mindful of how their allies perceive them. It's not just about demanding more money or troops. It's about building real partnerships based on shared interests and mutual respect.
So it's not just a military game or an economic game. It's a diplomatic game too, right?
Absolutely. Succeeding in the Pacific requires a multifaceted approach. You need diplomacy, economics, and military strength. It's about building a network of alliances and partnerships that can effectively counter China's growing influence without, sparking a conflict.
Sounds like the U.S. is walking a tightrope, trying to maintain their leadership in a world that's changing fast.
You said it. The old rules don't apply anymore. The U.S. has to be more agile, more strategic, and more collaborative if they want to stay on top in a world where power is becoming, more spread out.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about all this from the perspective of people just living their lives in these countries. What are they thinking about all this big power shift happening around them?
Well, if you talk to people in South Korea, for instance, you'd probably find a mix of worry and, practicality. On one hand, there's definitely concern about being caught in the middle if things, escalate between the U.S. and China. Nobody wants a war in their backyard.
Yeah, makes sense. It's one thing to talk about, like, military strategy, but it's different when you think about what it would actually mean for real people, families, businesses, whole communities.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole history with Japan that we've been talking about. For a lot of Koreans, the idea of working more closely with Japan militarily is, let's just say it doesn't sit well with them.
But, South Korea also has a pretty strong economic relationship with China, right? Wouldn't pushing back against China too hard risk hurting that?
That's the tough spot South Korea's in. They're trying to balance those security concerns with their economic ties. They don't want to upset China, but they know how important their alliance with the U.S. is.
So it's not as simple as picking sides. It's about managing all these different relationships, economic, diplomatic, everything.
Exactly. And for the average person in South Korea, it just creates a lot of uncertainty about the future. Will they have to choose between, their economic well-being and their national security?
Those are some tough questions. No easy answers there. This video also talked about the financial side of things, like the pressure on U.S. allies to spend more on defense. They mentioned President Trump demanding South Korea to pay like 9 times more for U.S. forces there. That's a pretty big ask.
Yeah, that definitely caused a stir in South Korea. An increase like that would have a huge impact on their own spending priorities.
I bet that led to some tense negotiations. How did South Korea respond to that?
Well, it sparked a lot of debate in South Korea about whether that demand was fair, whether they were being asked to pay too much for, deterring China. It also showed that South Korea has some leverage in these talks.
Leverage? How so?
Well, they could link their defense contributions to other things like, trade deals or access to U.S. markets for Korean companies. It becomes part of a bigger negotiation, a bigger game.
So it's not just about military power. It's about using those economic and diplomatic tools to get what you want.
Right, and we're seeing this not just with South Korea, but all over the world. More and more countries are reevaluating their defense spending, looking at ways to shift money around, even funds meant for economic development to support military initiatives indirectly.
So this pressure to, militarize is being felt everywhere, not just in the Pacific.
Yeah, it's a ripple effect from this whole power shift. As China becomes more powerful globally, other countries feel like they have to adjust their own strategies, to stay safe and protect their interests.
This whole deep dive has been really insightful. We've gone over so much the sheer size of China's navy, the strategy behind those island chains, the whole idea of unrestricted warfare, and what it all means for people living in these countries.
Yeah, and we've seen how this rivalry is changing the game, not just militarily, but economically and diplomatically, too. It's a complex situation, no easy solutions, but the more we understand the details, the better we can grasp what it all means for global stability and, the future.
I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is how interconnected everything is. It's not just about who has the most ships or the best weapons. It's about history, economics, diplomacy, and how people view each other. It's all connected.
Exactly. That's why we need to look at the big picture, consider all these things when we try to understand these, complicated global challenges.
So for everyone listening who's now thinking about all of this, what's the one question they should be asking themselves as they, keep learning about this topic?
I'd say the most crucial question is this. In a world where it's getting harder to tell the difference between peace and war, where the old rules of war are being thrown out, and where economic and diplomatic tools are just as important as military power, how do we keep the world stable? How do we make sure things don't spiral out of control?
That's a really profound question, and one that I think we'll be grappling with for a long time. But by having these conversations, by trying to see things from different angles, and by really thinking critically about the challenges we face, maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to a more peaceful and prosperous future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon to explore more of the forces shaping our world.